Welcome along to the latest Seahawks Draft Blog live stream. Rob Staton and Jeff Simmons with you here today. We're about 24 hours away from the cut-down day when everything's going to get announced, and there's going to be a whole bunch of players who are going to change teams, and it's going to be an interesting week for the Seahawks to see what they do, with a lot of storylines to get into and a lot of things we need to catch up on. Jeff, let's just start with this, though. How do you feel about the Seahawks? You know, we're like a couple of weeks away from the season starting. Gone through training camp, gone through the preseason now. Geno Smith's been announced as the starting quarterback. We've kind of got a feeling on how this roster is going to look when the season begins. How do you feel about the Seahawks right now?
Well, one, I'm happy the preseason's over. I could not take much more of those games. The Seahawks do not have a great looking depth right now. And a lot of the players who played most of those games either are not going to be on the team or they're not going to play during the year. So more or less, my sense is that this is going to be a difficult season. And I think it's easy to say that after the draft. I know we had talked about that, but I'm getting the sense just seeing the reaction, seeing some of the kind of overreactions, in my opinion. It's a lot easier to say it's going to be difficult, but to actually watch it, it's going to be difficult. So for the most part, I'm just trying to take a big picture view of everything right now. And I'm just trying to focus on things that I think matter. And really, for me, that's players who are going to be contributors in 2023. So really, that's been my focus of preseason. And from that standpoint, it's not been as bad as it looked. The guys I've been focusing on, for the most part, have been pretty interesting. And I'm trying to urge everyone not to invest in this quarterback group, because I see Greg Bell or some of the other beat writers every day giving daily updates on Geno versus Locke, and I'm just not there. Like, I can't get into those guys. And so I'm trying to tell people just kind of pick your position groups, pick the players in the team, because they're just not going to be a very good team this year. I think there's going to be a learning curve for a lot of their rookies. They just don't have a lot of depth. They don't have a lot of talent. And I think all that kind of sets up to what hopefully is their plan for 2023. But it's going to be ugly to start. I really do believe that.
So a couple of points I want to get into with you there off the back of what you've said. I think the first thing is, it's a really interesting point to say. People like me and you can sit here in, I don't know, May and say completely comfortable with a bad season. You know, it is what it is. It's about getting into the 2023 draft class and finding a young quarterback for the future, which is a perfectly legit. It's the way that everybody should feel about this, I think. But there's going to be a whole bunch of fans who may well have felt that way in May and may well feel that way as we enter September, Jeff. Let's see how they feel if the Seahawks start 1-5. That's going to be the acid test. For all of the people who are prepared to endure a bad year, are they going to feel that way when the bad year is ongoing? When they're investing 3 to 4 hours in a Seahawks game with Geno Smith at quarterback, with a bad product potentially on the table, and with a lot of flaws exposed, and just essentially you could get into October, the second month of the season, and feel like the season's gone. That you've kind of got all these other teams, and there may even be 3 of them in the NFC West, Jeff, who are dreaming of what could happen this year and playoff runs and stuff like that. And you may be left as a Seahawks fan behind, with only the college football to watch on the hope that one of these quarterbacks may end up being the answer for the Seahawks. That's going to be a challenge for this fan base. Right now is the easy bit to say you're okay with a bad year. Saying that in October is going to be a lot harder, I think.
Yeah, and that's the reality. And I could tell just from the preseason. Geno Smith is I know you've heard about this. He's as vanilla of a quarterback option as it gets. And there's a term in baseball, I don't know how closely you follow baseball, but there's a term in baseball called a 4A player, which is someone who's good enough to play against backups and do well and play at the minor league levels. When they come up to the pros, they just can't cut it. And Geno is the equivalent of a 4A player. I think Drew Lock is the equivalent of a 4A player. And based on how Drew Lock played in the preseason, we don't even know if he would do well against backups. So he looked pretty terrible. And like you said, it's very easy to see a plan, but to actually sit through it and watch Geno Smith every week. And a lot of these fans, they were a Super Bowl contender for a good period of time. And every year that Russell Wilson was there has screwed up. And me and you have talked about all the bad decisions the organization has made. Having that Russell Wilson every year at least gave them hope to be a playoff team. Maybe you can win a couple rounds, maybe get hot at the end of the year. They weren't terrible. They were a playoff contender basically every year before last year, and this is not going to be happen this year. Going from Russell Wilson to Geno Smith, it's just going to require a different mindset from fans because, it's not going to be pretty at first. There's going to be a big learning curve. And I know against some of the players, I imagine, but it's a lot different going against backups versus Nick Bosa and Bradley Chubb and Cam Jordan and Aiden Hutchinson back to back to back. And it's going to be a challenge. And I think as a big picture thinker, you got to hope, okay, the ideal thing is like the year before the Bengals got Joe Burrow. Watching that Bengals year with like Andy Dalton was pretty bad. They were 2-14. They didn't have a lot of talent. AJ Green was barely playing. And getting Joe Burrow, they're in the Super Bowl 2 years later. And that's obviously the best case scenario. I don't know if you're going to get a Joe Burrow in this next draft, but I'm trying to urge everyone as much as they can to keep the big picture in mind, because if they start taking shortcuts or they start doing silly things with their roster, then we need to alarm all these alarm bells off, because really by playing Geno, by going with Drew Lock, it seems like there's a clear plan in place by passing on all the rookie quarterbacks. And talk about overreaction to preseason. Some of the takes on these Ritter and Willis have been absurd to me, but yeah, you probably know that better than anyone. But I think it's just maintaining patience, because if you remember, everyone compares this to 2011. I know I saw you reference this the other day. I don't know how many people remember that Steelers game in 2011 to start the year. It was one of the worst Seahawks games I've ever seen. And this team does not have the talent of the 2011 team. There's some nice pieces, but they don't. You wrote that as well. But that was one of the worst Seahawks games I've seen. There was a 6-3 game against the Browns that year. I don't know if it'll be that bad, but I think you made a great point. But the New Orleans game last year where Geno Smith just couldn't – he threw like a 90-yard touchdown at DK in the first series. And after that, it was a slog. And I think there's just going to be a lot of games like that to start. That's how Geno Smith is.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that if I've said this in a video the other day, that if everything's on time and you're playing a bad opponent like they had against Jacksonville, because that game gets brought up a lot with Geno Smith. I want to talk a little bit about Geno Smith later on, but that game gets brought up a lot. Urban Meyer's in the middle of his meltdown in Jacksonville when that game happens. And the Jaguars had a rookie quarterback, and they've come to Seattle, and the Seahawks just were able to keep them at arm's length. And in that kind of situation, Geno Smith and pretty much any quarterback in the league should have been able to manage that to a comfortable win. The acid test is the game like New Orleans, where you're not playing an elite team, but you're playing a good defense. Can you move the ball? Can you put some points on the board? Can you keep a game honest? And the answer was no, they could not. They were clearly second best in that game. Offensively, couldn't do anything. And my fear is that when they play good defenses, we're going to see a whole lot more of that, and not what we saw against Jacksonville. And people have been talking again. We'll get onto the quarterback things. I know that you quite rightly say it's not something that really warrants a great deal of analysis, but I do think there is one interesting point that isn't discussed that I want us to get into today on this quarterback thing. But people have been talking about, well, you can't. Drew Lock's erratic, and Geno will just manage things. But people seem to forget that the Seahawks lost 2 games last year because essentially they were ended on Geno Smith turnovers. And yes, he had a nice cameo against the Rams, but his interception ended that game. And the Pittsburgh game, he fumbled the ball, which led to a turnover in overtime, and they lost that game. So let's not forget that as well. And let's also not forget that Geno Smith has 34 touchdowns, I think, and 37 interceptions in his career. So I think there's a lot of bad stuff being said about Geno, or inaccurate stuff, I should say, about Geno Smith. One thing I want to touch on this before we get on to perhaps that interesting point that I want to touch on, Jeff. I think the Seahawks have done a bad job in communications again this year. Now, when I say they've done a bad job with communications surrounding managing expectations this year, the common reply to that is, well, what did you expect them to say? Did you expect them to announce it was a massive rebuild, that the team was going to be bad? You can't do that. That would demotivate the team. You would lose a lot of players. They wouldn't have been able to re-sign DK Metcalf and Quandre Diggs. Look, I'm not for a second suggesting that Pete Carroll should have come out and said, we are going to be this year's version of the Jaguars. And we may be for a couple of years to manage expectations. But I think you can, with your words, prepare Seahawks fans in a way that they haven't done. The message has consistently been, we are not rebuilding. We want to go for it. We truly believe in Geno Smith and Drew Lock. Hey, Drew Lock's really good. Hey, Geno Smith, do you know Geno Smith? He did well last year. He's really good. We have 2 number 1 quarterbacks. We are not going to rebuild. We think we're going to be right back up there trying to be a championship team next year. If you keep saying those things, then fans will not need any excuse to hold your feet to the fire if things go badly. What I think they could have said differently, Jeff, is look, whenever you trade a franchise quarterback, you have to go through a process. We intend to put a competitive team on the field this year. But we would also call for a little bit of patience as we work through this process now. And I think you can say, please be patient with us without actually saying it. I think they've gone too far the other way. And for me, this is as bad as PR job in terms of managing fan expectation as it was a year ago when they came out and said this whole Russell Wilson trade thing is a media creation. It's an absolute nonsense. It kind of feels that was insulting fan intelligence. And I think saying we have two number one quarterbacks was equally insulting fan intelligence. I'm not sure they're giving themselves much rope here. As someone like yourself who is prepared for a bad season and just wants the team to get to the 2023 draft as quickly as possible, I don't think they've done a very good job of putting them in a position to get fans through the next 3 or 4 months.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think part of the job of a coach or sometimes some organizations, the GM is kind of the head honcho. I really think it is managing expectations. And Pete is wired a little differently than most pro sports figures, but I've been critical of other sports I've covered. And I know you cover other sports as well, where they have not managed expectations and they've set poor expectations with their fans. And it's a good way to just kind of sour the mood around the team, how the team's covered, all sorts of different things. And that really is part of their job because the fans don't dictate personnel moves, but they dictate the mood around the team. They dictate the relationship made with ownership. And I think Pete could have done a much better job of not being honest because that's just not how he's wired. He can see the best in someone like LJ Collier, where most of us can watch him and just can't see anything. So, but I do think there's a better way they could have done this. And I just think there's a way they could have sold it in a reasonable way that they're using this year to develop and transition young players. And Gino's a guy who knows their offense and they can trust him to run plays while they're developing 2 rookie tackles. And Gino makes sense. And they've done it with Tavares Jackson. Like they've done it before. I don't remember how they talked about that year in particular, but if you remember, like Tavares Jackson that year, he's pretty to the same spot as his career as Gino is. They even have very similar skill set and limitations. Like you can think of that Pittsburgh fumble last year. There was a game in 2011 where the Seahawks were playing the Niners and they were coming back and Tavares Jackson gets strip sacked at the 40. And that's the Gino play in the Pittsburgh game last year. They lose the game. So I do think it just said the wrong message because you speak with your moves and you speak with your wallet, and the fact that they didn't really invest in the quarterback position when they could have got Baker, or they could have drafted Malik Willis or Ritter. Those guys fell a lot further than everyone thought. But the fact that they didn't really make a move at quarterback set up to what seemed like an encouraging plan back in May. But the messaging was different than that. And maybe signing Quandre and DK, maybe that they were hoping that would kind of buy some time. But I think the roster moves are pretty obvious what they're doing. And they're being disingenuous. If they are believing like that, I know Pete's wired like that. I don't think it just sends the right message because then if they start losing, and to me, losing is fine this year if the right guys are developing. But if they start losing and Pete has this message, we're trying to win, we're trying to compete. From Jody Allen's standpoint, that doesn't look great. From the fan standpoint, that doesn't look great. So to me, I just think he almost set himself up for the wrong messaging. Because after trading a franchise quarterback for draft picks, it's very obvious what you're doing. And when you're playing 2 rookie tackles and potentially 2 rookie corners and all kinds of different spots where edge rushers are very inexperienced, it's pretty obvious what they're doing. But just like you said, you send the wrong message. You go 1-5. The tone of around the team is going to be very different. The locker room is going to be very different. The media is going to be asking different questions. So they could have really managed the whole situation a hell of a lot better.
Yeah, I think this first game, I'd be curious. I'd love to know what Pete Carroll really thinks about playing Denver and Wilson week 1. I think the NFL have done a great job putting this in week 1 from a neutral's perspective because this is the best time for this game to happen. If the Seahawks start badly and they play mid-season, then it's not much of a contest. But Wilson coming back when both teams are 0-0 to start the season is interesting. It makes you want to watch, makes you want to see what happens. And I think in a game in week 1, all teams are far from the finished product. They're messy games. It doesn't matter what it is, and one team can blow another team away. We have seen that on opening day. But we also see these like really scrappy games where nobody's functioning properly. And the Seahawks have a puncher's chance in this game. But if it goes badly, that could set the tone for some real issues for the Seahawks. If Russell Wilson comes to Seattle and puts on a show, playing the kind of brand of football he's been begging the Seahawks to play for 3, 4, 5 years, and the Seahawks under Geno Smith just can't move the football, if they were booing in a preseason game against Chicago, that's going to be 10 times louder in this game. And it could create... So on the one hand, a win against Wilson and the Broncos could really lift the team. An ugly loss could really blow this thing apart. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in week 1. The one thing I wanted to get on with the quarterback thing, because I do think, and by the way, if anybody wants to send in a super chat, feel free. We will come to questions. I know there's a lot of people in the chat. Super chats will get priority. If you send a super chat in, we will get those questions to Jeff ASAP. If you've got a question, super chat away. But the one thing that I think is interesting, because generally speaking, Jeff, and I know I've probably spent more time talking about the quarterbacks than I anticipated, because I'm 100% in line with you that it's an irrelevant topic for the most part. And this is all about, let's watch as much college football over the next few months and see who's out there. This is all about the draft in 2023. And I think it is a decent... I don't think it's as good a quarterback crop as everyone's saying, but it's a good one. It's a better one than 2022 for sure. But there is one interesting angle that I want to put to you today. I think it is interesting to see this play out from the Pete Carroll perspective, because I think we learn how he's thinking in the next 7 days. Because if the Seahawks go out and sign Jimmy Garoppolo, if he's released, it tells us something. If the Seahawks... Well, they have picked Geno Smith to start. It does tell us something about Pete's thinking, and I don't think this has been much of a competition. How they approach this over the next 6 weeks, depending on how this goes, is going to tell us a lot about Pete Carroll. Because as much as it appears they just want to get through this year, we just don't know, because they're never going to spell that out. We're never going to hear Pete say, this is about getting into the draft. So all we can do is react to what actually happens here. Now, I think if Pete was... my word, I need to compete this year, they would have done a lot more than just roll with Geno Smith and Drew Lock. They would have signed somebody back in March or April. They've not done that. So that's the first telltale sign. But after a really challenging, I think anyway, preseason, where the team looked especially bad against Chicago, it can't tackle. Geno Smith had 7 scoreless drives against the Bears. He scored 1 touchdown in 3 preseason games, and yet he's got the job by default almost. I wonder, Jeff, whether Pete Carroll will start to think, hang on a minute, the ideal is to get through to 2023, but this ain't 2011 anymore. I haven't got the benefit of the doubt of taking over a rebuild. Now I'm the guy who traded Russell Wilson. I'm the guy who said, I want to trade Russell Wilson. And if Russell Wilson does well, I can't afford... If Russell Wilson has a deep playoff run or even wins the Super Bowl with Denver, my arse is going to be on the chop, is going to be up there. People are going to be thinking, what have you done? You've traded away that guy. He's gone to Denver and done ever so well. And you've rolled with Geno Smith. And you're a 3-win team. If that was that's the sort of most extreme example of this situation. But how he handles this, because he's no longer in a position, Jeff, I think, where people are overwhelmingly going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I think that it's this awkward position where the ideal is the Seahawks just kind of grit the teeth and get through 2022. But he might feel like he's not in the strongest position just to endure the worst case scenario here. And that might influence what he does in the quarterback position.
Oh, absolutely. That is by far the most intriguing part of the Seahawks right now, to see if they do something on Jimmy. And from my perspective, signing Jimmy Garoppolo is the worst thing they could do. I think it reeks of a team that's trying to chase the 7th playoff seed versus someone who's trying to execute a plan. And for me, the plan is pretty good. And there was no real quarterback answers when they traded Russell, which is why I thought they would trade him next year. But they did it a year early, and it might have got them a left tackle and some other things. But if Pete gets antsy, and we all saw the same preseason game, they look bad, and tries to get Jimmy Garoppolo in here, tries to take shortcuts, because I was worried they were going to trade for Baker Mayfield. I thought there were some people in the Seahawks organization that came from Cleveland when they drafted him, and I could see John liking his kind of swagger, and that to me was the same kind of vein. But if they come out, they bring in Jimmy Garoppolo, he transitions to the quarterback. To me, that should bring up alarm bells throughout the whole organization, because to me, that just shows that there's misalignment between Pete and the front office, that they're not committed to a rebuild. They're trying to take shortcuts. To me, that would be worrisome. And if Jimmy plays, like, they could win 6-7 games with him and potentially position themselves out of getting a quarterback or getting the quarterback they want, or having to use the rest of their capital to all trade up to get that one quarterback. And as you can see, the roster still is not solved. Like, they have some really interesting position groups, but there's some really, really bad ones. Like, the inside linebacker group looks terrible. And they don't have a third receiver right now. I don't know. The Eskridge, we have to see him get through a year. But their receiving depth looks very troubling right now, especially for a big picture, long term. If DK or Tyler gets hurt, it could get really, really bad. So if they start taking shortcuts and Pete gets antsy, and I think Pete's very fortunate that he has the relationship he has with the owner. If it was more of a traditional owner who didn't inherit the team, that bought the team, I know Jody Allen's taken on more of a role, and apparently her and Pete are very close. But if it was a different owner, I think Pete would definitely be on the hot seat, where your star quarterback wants out. The relationship clearly fell apart there. And I think Pete is very fortunate that he might not be in that spot. And maybe that's concerning to Seahawks fans. But I think these next couple of weeks, when Jimmy Garoppolo eventually does come released, that's going to tell us everything we need to know. And if they make a move there, there's going to be a lot of concerned fans. Let's say that.
Let me pitch this to you, because I just want to play devil's advocate. This is not necessarily how I feel. What would you say to someone who would propose this? You try to win, and in the words that you use there.
Hold on. Jimmy Garoppolo is closing in on a deal with the Niners, and he's going to be their backup quarterback.
Wow.
Mike Garoppolo just tweeted.
Yeah, Adam Schefter has just put it out as well. Jimmy Garoppolo and the 49ers agreed to a restructured one-year contract that will keep him in San Francisco. The contract contains no trade and no tag clauses, assuring Garoppolo will remain in San Francisco this season and have the freedom to leave in 2023. So that's interesting. He's off the table for the Seahawks then, and he will be the backup quarterback. Now, see, I mean, we've got to kind of pivot to this quickly. I know this is a Seahawks stream, and we will get back to what the point I was about to propose to Jeff, because it has changed somewhat by this news. But this is interesting, Jeff, because from a San Francisco point of view, I would only keep him around on a restructured contract if I did not have complete faith in the guy that I've spent 3 first-round picks on. Now, I did not think Trey Lance was worth the number 3 pick, let alone spending 2 extra picks to go from wherever they were to number 3 in the first place. He had 11 games in college for North Dakota State, and there was nothing in those 11 games that warranted this level of investment. And the Niners went for it, and I was stunned that they picked him. And he's had his redshirt year, and now here he is, and they're bringing back Jimmy Garoppolo as just in case this goes badly, we'll have Jimmy Garoppolo again. The guy who they traded all those picks for to replace is potentially going to be starting for San Francisco again this year when Trey Lance proves not to be the answer. I mean, we have issues in Seattle. At least we've got, we know what's coming, and we can look forward to a draft. In San Francisco, I've been wondering who the heck are making these decisions here, because they have fudged this quarterback situation for the last 4 or 5 years, and they probably cost themselves titles. This is the front office who admitted they didn't even scout Patrick Mahomes because they were waiting for Kirk Cousins the following year. They didn't even watch Mahomes properly. I mean, imagine if he'd ended up in San Francisco with Kyle Shanahan. Praise the Lord. Not that I'm religious, that they did not do that. And look what they've left themselves in, a complete and utter mess of a situation where they're hoping that having Jimmy Garoppolo back will bail them out again if things go south with Lance.
Yeah, it's one of the untold stories, I think, in the NFL right now, because I remember watching Trey Lance last year in the preseason. I know it's preseason. And I was just wowed by the difference between what the messaging was around the league, or some of the best analysts like Daniel Jeremiah, Mina Kimes were talking about how the Niners were going to unleash this offense that couldn't be stopped. And I watched him play last year, and he reminded me sort of when Colin Kaepernick sort of went off the rails, and he he could throw the hell of the ball, he can run, but when he had to just run like a basic touch pass or a basic route, he was very inaccurate. And he looked like a guy who just was very, very raw and not very refined. And when you watch him again in the preseason this year, it was the same sort of thing. And I think the fact that they're keeping Garoppolo is so telling. I think they need an insurance policy there because their rest of their roster is built for a Super Bowl run. And we saw Jimmy took them to the NFC Championship last year, but I think there's a pretty good case that with better quarterback play, they would have probably won the Super Bowl last year, and they probably would have won it against Kansas City 2 years ago. So Jimmy's been a limitation for them. And the Trey Lance story is super interesting because I know some of the reporters nationally have talked about this, but story and corroborated with the stories I heard, Kyle didn't want to draft Trey Lance. He wanted Mac Jones. And when they made that trade up, that was the plan. And from what I understand, the front office was not sold on Mac Jones. They thought physically he was too limited of a player. And we know Kyle's favorite quarterback in the last 10 years has probably been Kirk Cousins, Matt Ryan. Mac was more along with those guys, and we've seen them run his offense very well. And I think that what happened when they played Josh Allen the year they made that trade, Josh Allen tore them apart. And I think the front office wanted their version of Josh Allen. And Trey Lance was the small school guy. He was raw. I think that was more of a compromise. And even just watching Justin Fields the last couple of weeks, he's looked far more interesting to me than Lance. And to me, like if that situation falls apart, you talk about the Mahomes thing at the time, Deshaun Watson, they took Solomon Thomas, who's basically out of the league now, over those guys. And I think we have to start looking at that team a little differently. Like they've really potentially bungled this quarterback position, and the rest of their roster is really, really good. And if Lance can't play, that team things could get really crazy if that becomes a quarterback controversy. And again, I think the fact that they're keeping him is so telling.
Jeff, what we're going to have every single week now. Every time Trey Lance botches a third down completion or throws a pick, the camera's immediately going to pan to Jimmy Garoppolo stood on the sideline. They're going to have that every single week. You are going to have all of the talking heads on Monday morning talking about should Jimmy Garoppolo come in for Trey Lance after every loss, after every bad performance, even if the Niners are winning, but Lance isn't playing well. Should Jimmy G come back in to get him back to the NFC Championship game like last year? You are going to have so much drama from this. And from Jimmy Garoppolo's perspective, I find it interesting. So the contract is the potential worth is $16 million. I'm convinced he would not have got that on the open market. I mean, the Seahawks would not have paid that, for example. The Seahawks don't even have that much cap space. They've got nearly $16 million of cap space remaining. So they couldn't match that kind of contract for the Niners. So this is probably the most money that he was going to get. And this gives him a year to recover properly, be a backup, not damage his stock. You know, if he sits on the bench and Trey Lance is great for a year, then he gets to enter free agency with no real lost stock. And he'll be $9 million richer based if he doesn't start. And if he does start, maybe he comes in as the hero again and boosts his position. So I kind of understand it from his point of view. But at the same time, from the Niners' point of view, it just looks like they've inherited a load of drama. Anyway, that's interesting. That's some breaking news live on the stream. I want to come back to the point I was going to make before that news broke, Jeff, which is some people would suggest the best thing for the Seahawks to do is not actually to end up with a pick in the top 10. That what they're best doing is trying to succeed, even if that means picking, let's say, in the early 20s, getting that 7th spot or whatever that gets you these days, like 19th, 20th in the draft, let's say. But having some form of success so that you develop, you maybe build some momentum. And then because you've got a treasure trove of picks, one, you could argue the roster would be in a decent position because it was good enough to get to the playoffs with someone like Geno Smith or Drew Lock at quarterback. So you would really just be missing the quarterback at that point. And two, you can trade up and get them. And you've got sort of you're not having a hopeless team. You know, a good young quarterback's coming into a relatively decent team, and he might be the final piece. That is the argument that could be made. I'm not sure that I agree with it, but I suppose the alternative to that is if you are just really bad, then we might be sat here and going, yeah, they need a quarterback, but they also need this, and this. And what are you going to do? And if you're not picking number one overall, may have to trade up anyway. I don't know. There's all sorts of sort of different angles to this. I mean, I remember in 2010, I did not want the Seahawks to win that final game against the Rams because I didn't think there was any benefit to being 7-9 division champions and getting bumped out the playoffs. But then obviously Beastquake happens and you beat the Saints. It's a historic moment for the Seahawks, a legendary moment in NFL history. And I think it started to build some momentum behind the Seahawks. So it was important for that to happen with hindsight. And they got Russell Wilson 2 years later. If they'd have picked in the top 10, would they have taken Jake Locker? Would they have taken Blaine Gabbert? Would they have taken Christian Ponder? Who knows? So it worked out well in the end. So I guess the point I'm saying is that even though I'd probably rather just pick, I don't know, 5th overall and get Will Levis, as we sit here today on the 29th of August, some people could make an argument that being better and trading up is a good way to go about things as well. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I understand that. I just think those situations are almost few and far between. Like the Russell Wilson scenario is, I don't know how repeatable that is. So, yeah, obviously the best thing for this year was to be, I said earlier, would be have a lot of these guys who are going to be key players in 2023 be ahead of schedule and be good enough to make them competitive now. But it really depends on what's driving a lot of their success, I believe. Like if it's guys who aren't going to be here next year or guys who are going to be tough to sign or some of the guys like Jamal Adams, whose the production's been a little volatile, then great. But to me, it's far more important, or if Rashad Penny plays like he did last year, then great. But to me, it's far more important just to develop the core players who are going to be with that quarterback. So to me, if Cross and Lucas are great and the offensive line is by the end of the year is ascending and that's what drives you to the 7th spot, that to me is a worthy spot. If the defense and Jordan Brooks and some of these corners, sure, that would be great. But to me, I think all that can happen. You can still be in that position to get the Will Levis because I just think the team is limited from a talent standpoint and from a personnel standpoint. So, yeah, it's not the end of the world, but I think the far most important thing, because the thing that would worry me the other way is that's how you just become what Denver was the last couple of years, where the roster's pretty good and they're competitive with Teddy Bridgewater. But how do they get better? They're sort of caught in that no man's land, and you're going 7 years trying to find these 1-year options. Carolina's going through that now. The rest of their roster is pretty good, but they don't have a quarterback. And Carolina had to go in the Deshaun Watson thing, and they passed on Fields in last year. And you look that their defense is pretty good. Their skill players are really good, but same sort of thing. So to me, by far the best scenario. What gives you the high ceiling? I mentioned the Bengals example where they were 2-14, but they get the same year. They get Burrow, they get T. Higgins, they get Jamar Chase, and they're in the Super Bowl 2 years later. So to me, I'm trying to look at what brings them back to being a contender. If they want to be the Denver, the Miami, that kind of team, then maybe that playoff spot, developing the rest of your team is great. But then again, who's your quarterback next year? And even the Rams, who had a great team, like if they weren't able to get Matt Stafford, they had Jared Goff, they were sort of in that no man's land for a while too. And they even made the Super Bowl. But like same with the Niners, like you saw what they had to pay to get Trey Lance. Like it gets desperate. So if this is the opportunity to get a quarterback, to me, the best opportunity for the trajectory of the franchise is whatever gets you the best quarterback. And to me, that's why I'd rather be 5th pick than be, say, 17th with a good year.
And a quick digression on just a quick point on the draft. I spent a bit of time over the last 3 weeks watching non-quarterbacks so that I can get a feel for when the college football season starts. Who are the other players? Because this is important as well, because it's good to know who are the players that teams might be persuaded to draft instead of a quarterback. If their guy goes, or if they pick that, for example, the team that picks 1st overall next year is probably going to have a big choice to make between do they get the quarterback or do they go and take Will Anderson? Because Will Anderson might be the best pass rusher to come into the league since Myles Garrett. It may even be better than Myles Garrett. I mean, just look at his stats from last year. He had something like 25 tackles for a loss. I mean, it's ridiculous. He's insane. And he's got Cam Chancellor type attitude. He wears Cam Chancellor's number. I don't think that's a coincidence. He is a fantastic talent, but I think you've got him. You've got a guy called Brian Bresee at Clemson, who's a defensive tackle who had an ACL last year, but watch his tape, unbelievable player. You've got Jalen Carter, who is not as good as Bresee for me at Clemson, but Jalen Carter at Georgia is another one. So they're 3 players, all defensive linemen, they tend to go early, who could find a home in the top 10, which means that you don't necessarily have to be 1st overall to get one of these good quarterbacks. And then what I think we're going to find as the process goes on, I think right now we're in the honeymoon period for these guys. So your Bryce Youngs and your CJ Strouds, no one challenges them. Everything's positive. It's just assumed they're going to be the top 2 quarterbacks. When we actually get into the college football season and they have the ups and downs of a season and people start talking to people in the league, and Bryce Young, we're going to hear Bryce Young's 5'9". We're going to hear that CJ Stroud's perhaps a little bit more erratic and is in a system and an offense which has just churned out production for years. And he gets to throw to 3 or 4 first-round picks every year in a division that can't handle it. So I think those players are going to come down, and then you're probably going to get players pumped up. So if Tyler Van Dyke, I fear for Tyler Van Dyke with a coach who's gone from Oregon to Miami because he made Justin Herbert look boring. So I think there's every chance that he's going to make Tyler Van Dyke look boring as well. But if he plays as expected he did last season, he will start jumping up boards. And Will Levis, if he does what he did last year again and keeps Kentucky competitive, he will move up. So there's a lot of jostling for position here. To cut a long story short, I don't think you necessarily need to be picking first overall to get a good quarterback. I think there's a chance that some of these guys will be available 5, 6, 7, 8. It's just always the way. I mean, look, there was good quarterback. There's always one good quarterback who seems to just go a little bit later. Josh Allen's a good example of that. Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Josh Rosen were the 3 golden quarterbacks in 2018. Josh Allen was, he's a small school guy. He's erratic. He makes too many mistakes. And he's ended up being the best of the bunch. Lamar Jackson was at the end of the first round that year. And look at the guy who's gone first overall. He's just been cut and he's in Carolina now, trying to save his career, coincidentally with a guy who went second overall, who was also in Carolina. So I don't think you necessarily have to, be first overall. I think you can be a solid top 10 team and get what you need to from this draft. And who knows what happens to the Broncos. If Russell Wilson hurts his finger again, they may well join you in the top end of the first round. We'll see what happens there. Key message: if you want to send a super chat, a bit quiet on the super chats tonight, but I'll just give it one final plug. If you want to get a question in, that is the way to do it. I'm seeing a lot of comments. We're going to just stick to super chats in terms of questions. We've got a lot to get through. I wanted to ask you about the quarterback competition, Jeff, and I know that this is another quarterback related question. We've already clearly clarified that neither of us are particularly interested in this quarterback competition. So apologies for another question on it. What do you make of the competition though, and the way it's been handled? Because I know that they were never going to, pitch this as anything other than a great competition between 2 admirable quarterbacks. But I kind of feel like Geno Smith didn't win this job. Geno Smith scored 1 touchdown in 3 games. He had 7 scoreless drives. Geno Smith has not. I know PFF said, "Oh, what a fantastic game he had against Chicago," and it was all those drops. Geno Smith does not. He doesn't make anything happen. Doesn't inspire. He can't play. If you're sort of not playing well and you need somebody to dig you out of the hole, Geno Smith's not going to do that. If you're playing badly, Geno Smith's going to just make you play worse, or he's going to just sort of keep things bad. He's not going to grab you out of it. And he didn't win this job. He's just, and I feel a little bit for Drew Lock, because to me it was like Geno Smith was constantly pitched as he's the leading guy. And to me, it just felt a little bit like, as long as he just goes into every game thinking a punt is okay, I just don't turn it over, then I will win this job. Whereas for Drew Lock, he had to go and win it. He had to take more chances. He had to sort of do all the stuff that Geno's doing, play safe, protect the ball. But I've got to throw it downfield and score amazing touchdowns. Otherwise, I can't overtake this guy. I don't think it was ever a particularly fair competition. And I wish that the media would say to Pete Carroll, rather than just buying all this stuff about how competent Geno Smith is, I'd rather them say, what has he actually shown you? And why have you gone with him? Because it's easy to point to Drew Lock and say he had those turnovers. But if Geno Smith is only getting this job, and they announced it 10 minutes after the Dallas game, if Geno Smith's only getting this because Drew Lock played really erratically against Dallas, doesn't that just suggest that you did a bad job setting up this competition between 2 inadequate players? Because Geno Smith has not won this. And even if we accept that the quarterback position is not important, even if we accept that this is about the 2023 draft, Carroll still deserves to be pushed and probed on his quarterback situation, having traded Russell Wilson. He needs to answer to how we've come to this situation. And one other final point that I want to just bring up before I let you in, Jeff. Am I right in saying that Geno Smith after the game said he would have been satisfied with his career even if he didn't win the job to start in Seattle? My word, if that isn't a quote that makes you think, what on earth are we doing with this guy still being in Seattle? He would have been satisfied with his career if he hadn't have got the job. I mean, that, if nothing else, it doesn't really say much for his ambition.
Yeah, big picture, I just found the way Pete handled the whole competition to be very odd. And like right away, we're in camp. When you're doing a competition, you'd think you want to split half the reps with the ones and see who looks better. And basically all of camp, Geno was with the ones and Locke was with the twos. And maybe, I know what I've heard behind the scenes and what I think was reported by Albert Breer today was that Geno just is much further along in terms of checks and audibles and the room and things like that. But when the mock game came, the first preseason game, Locke just has some skills that Geno doesn't. And like you said, Geno is as vanilla as it gets. Like, he's a quarterback that just doesn't have playmaking skills at this level. And Tavares Jackson was very similar. He runs the plays as they're designed to be run. He'll take sacks. He'll fumble the ball. He'll throw some interceptions. But he's not a gunslinger. He's a very risk-averse player, which was very different than when he was at West Virginia. But at the NFL, he just doesn't have the ability to be a playmaker. And from a quarterback, that's not exciting. I know there's some parts of Twitter that are trying to tell you that Geno is better than he looks and his stats are better. PFF had him the third highest graded quarterback. I think we've seen enough of this guy where we know what he is and what he isn't. And I think the preseason was more indication. Yeah, you can make some good throws, but can he stack them? Can he win in the red zone? Can he win a 3rd and 9? I just don't see it. I think Geno's a guy who's a backup player. And what backup quarterbacks are designed to do is to not make mistakes, to keep the offense running as it's scheduled to be designed, and basically try to go 500 at best. And that's what Geno is. And there's just not a lot of upside there. I know he was a fun college prospect, but he's 31 years old. We've seen him for years. He's a backup quarterback. And again, I go back to that 4A player I talked about before. And I thought Locke was just playing from behind the whole offseason. I just don't understand really why they did it that way. I don't know if it was things they saw in the building. I don't know if Geno was further along in the meeting rooms, or maybe the coaching staff felt different than the front office on Drew Lock. Frankly, I never understood why they got Drew Lock in the first place, because I saw the player in Denver. I saw him in Missouri. To me, he's been exactly what I thought he'd be at the NFL level, which is not a safe backup quarterback and a guy you just can't trust to play. And he has been very frustrating to watch if you've watched any Denver the last couple of years. So I don't really understand what their approach was there. It's been an odd competition. And I think Geno almost won by default. I think Locke just never really got the reps. He looked pretty terrible from a turnover perspective, and we know what Pete Carroll thinks of that. And it seemed like he was chasing, and that's Pete always talks about trying to maximize performance and all that thing, and how he's trying to get them to be their best self. There's no way you can make a case he did that with Drew Lock. Like, Drew Lock barely played with the ones until the mock game. And then that week he was supposed to start, he gets COVID and can't even play. But just the whole design of it never really felt like a competition. It felt like a way of propping up Geno Smith. And to me, that was weird. And anyone who feels strongly about it is right on, because people will say things like, we have two great quarterbacks and there's no follow-up question. And I don't know if the PR staff just doesn't like that or whatever. Some PR staffs can control. But if I'm in that scrum and that quote comes out, my eyes are popping out of my head. And I'm asking them what he's watching that I'm not seeing. Because there's corners of the internet that, again, they'll tell you that Geno Smith is a pretty functional starting quarterback. But I think it's about clear to me what he is at this point.
Yeah, I mean, he's 32 this year. We're not talking about a Sam Ehlinger type. This is his second team, never really had a chance. We're talking about a guy that was drafted in the early second round, who's had multiple starts. I can't remember the exact number, but I think he's featured strongly in about 30 games. He's got more turnovers than touchdowns. We know what Geno Smith is, and if you'd have said 2 or 3 years ago, you are going to be preparing to watch the first week of a Seahawks season, and Geno Smith is the quarterback. And by the way, Russell Wilson's not injured. Geno Smith was selected as the starting quarterback. Most people would have gone, what have you been drinking? This is ridiculous. And here we are. We're preparing for Geno Smith at quarterback. Jeff, I don't know whether I suspect a lot of people are not going to want me to go down this line, but I'm going to go there anyway because it's something I've been talking about. I think I'm just ready for change. I know that the message this year, I've been supportive. I think something had to be done one way or the other with Wilson. They either had to move on from the head coach and bring a new coach in and maybe a new GM and just go behind and rally behind Wilson. I heard something this week which nearly made me cry as to what could have been an alternative if this team had gone that way. And I'm not going to go into it here, but it was depressing. And I'm sorry that is a massive tease. But oh my word. And then it either had to be that or it had to be a trade. And fine, they made their bed and now they have to sleep in it. But the more that I think about this, Jeff, I see the same issues reemerging during preseason that seem to have been there for a long time. The tackling. There's been no turnovers in preseason. Like the team just doesn't seem capable of turning the ball over on defense. The offense, I mean, can Pete actually, does he know how to bring in a good offensive coordinator? I mean, just look at the track record of the people he's brought in. Is Shane Waldron any good? Can the Seahawks have a really good offense without Russell Wilson being Russell Wilson with Pete Carroll in charge? Because we've not seen that. Pete has admitted himself that he wouldn't have been in Seattle anywhere near as long. His actual words. I would not have been here as long as I have been if it wasn't for Russell Wilson. I just feel like the whole franchise, Jeff, needs a new voice, a new face, a new leader at the top of the table. And even if Wilson had gone and they'd brought in even a Mike McDaniel type, and they'd brought in just some guy who Mike McDaniel knows, I kind of feel that would have been going, oh, this is new, this is different. And I know I wrote this myself. The counter to this is you bring in a young hotshot offensive coordinator from somewhere else, and they've not won a Super Bowl. They've not got the track record in football that Pete Carroll has got, whether that's at USC, whether that's here. And I totally take that on board. I think I'm ready, Jeff, for something different, for a change. I don't think he's got it in him over the next. I don't think he's got 5 years, and I don't think he is the best man to take this team forward. And we're here for the Seahawks. We're not here for it's not the Seattle Pete Carrolls. I think this team. I get that sense that Pete doesn't want to go out with the interception against New England as the defining moment of his tenure, which it possibly will be, rather than the Super Bowl win. And I think that's why he's clinging on, because he wants that redemption moment that people can go, you did it, Pete, well done. But I think that's why he's clinging on. I think he's clinging on to show that he knew best, that he could go out on a high when he wanted to. And I don't think that's best for the Seahawks. I think the Seahawks, and neither do I think it's best just getting this through until the sale. I think if you are Jody Allen and Burt Cole, you've got to say, look, we still have a responsibility not to let this drift. And what I don't want, Jeff, is this regime to draft a quarterback and use the Russell Wilson trade return. And then 12 months after they've used all those picks, so we're talking 2024 now, it's not worked. They've all gone. And then new people have come in, and we're seeing it now with the Raiders. Josh McDaniel brings his guy in from New England. They're all like, okay, we don't like him. We don't like him. We don't like him who you've traded for. We don't like him who you brought in for a first-round pick. We're going to cut the guy that you spent your first-round pick on last year, and we're going to go in a completely different direction. That will just make the Wilson trade a disaster if you people come in and have to inherit what somebody else has done. So I just think I'm ready, Jeff. I'm ready perhaps for a offensive-minded coach to draft the quarterback and for them to be like that from day one, rather than continue with this. And look, I will, if in 6-7 weeks' time I change my mind, I reserve the right to do that. And I will come out here and say what I said on the 29th of August was a load of old bollocks. I'll say that. But right now, that's how I feel.
No, I think that's reasonable. If you polled me last December or November, even now, I think all of us would have said we were ready for Pete Carroll to go. And I respect what Pete Carroll's done. I think it's been unfortunate to see how him and Russell split apart and how he's sort of become like a hated figure amongst a certain subset of the Seahawks. I think it's kind of sad to see that because of how good a lot of the work he's done. But I think he does just feel dated and stale. And I think he is a great coach and great at what he does. But I will say this. I think from an excitement standpoint, by far the best thing and the most exciting thing, and I don't have the information you do on that, but you might have heard. But I think from the fan standpoint, by far the most exciting thing would have been to pair Russell up with a new coach, an offensive coach. The one problem with that, and this problem was created by Pete and John, was just the roster was not in a place to be there. And they didn't have a left tackle. They had as we can still see, maybe Bobby Wagner stays. And the team just was not built because of years, and me and you have talked about this more than anyone. Pete and John have bungled the Russell Wilson era because of just bad roster management. So I think Russell with a flawed roster and maybe a coach that brings, we'd all be like, this year would be far more exciting. We'd be thrilled. But I think at the end of the day, they would have been limited ceiling-wise just because of what they were left with. So I will say, on the other hand, this path, which I'm not a huge Pete Carroll guy, and I am in the camp, but all things being even, I would rather have him an offensive coach, especially you can't count on Pete to develop a quarterback at this level based on the quarterback coaches he's surrounded himself with. They have never had a high-quality offensive coordinator. They've never had a high-quality quarterback coach. So that worries me. But I will say this roster and how they're doing it, to me, has a bigger ceiling than, as crazy it is with Geno at quarterback, than keeping Russell with an offensive mind. I think they were left with such a roster that looked so bleak. And it's why me and you were so upset with how they've handled things the last 2 years. This is the first time in a while I've actually liked how the roster is shaping up. Because we've talked about years, position groups that were tied by Scotch tape. How the roster had no plan. And they got really lucky in a couple senses. Like if Charles Cross doesn't fall to number 9, what the hell is their plan at left tackle? And I think Atlanta made a huge mistake not taking Cross. And so I don't want to credit Pete and John for that. But all of a sudden, they have an offensive line that now has potentially 2 to 3 long-term pieces. They have cornerback group that looks a lot better. They have potential some edge rushers, some of the skill positions. If they can kind of nail this next draft, their roster from just like a sustainability standpoint, if they can get the quarterback, obviously it's a huge if, to me looks way more complete and way more. And to me, that's what the Chargers have now. That's what they have, the rookie quarterback where you can spend on money, you have flexibility. They have all these high-level players. That's what the Seahawks need to get back to. And that's the only way they can win with Pete. That's the only way Pete can win. And when they won last time, Pete did at USC, they had better players than everyone else. And Pete is good in that situation. I'm not saying he needs superstars, but he's good at maximizing a crazy group of talent. He did at USC, he did here. When he has inferior talent, he looks like Vic Fangio. He looks like Rex Ryan. He looks like one of those guys. And if they don't nail these drafts, it's going to be hard to watch this team the next couple of years because they're just going to be that Rex Ryan Jets team where they just weren't able to progress. And so I'm in your camp where all things being equal, I would love to see a new coach. I just think it would bring so much enthusiasm to the fans, so much excitement. I used to love watching preseason. I remember when Pete first came out, excited I was for every game. I'm so far from that right now. I can sense you definitely are. I can sense a lot of fans. I've been staying off Twitter mostly. I'm probably going to be off and off Twitter this year just to kind of get through this. This is a Madden season. If you ever played Madden, I would simulate the season and get to the draft already. So that's how I feel about this team. But yeah, I'm with you on Pete for sure. Unfortunately, I just don't think it's a reality, and I've sort of accepted that. It's not ideal by any means, but I think Pete and John are tied with Jody Allen until they draft the quarterback, until they see how this plays out. And I think that's probably another 3 years of Pete. And it's hard to get excited about that because, again, he just feels kind of stale. We've seen this for 12 years now. And other than Bill Belichick and Tomlin, like how many guys have lasted 12 years through quarterback changes, regime changes? You need to cycle through coaches pretty regularly. And when you've heard the same stuff over and over, and all the LOB players have talked about that, it's just hard to keep hearing the same messaging and the same tone. and not have something new. So ideally, if things go off the rails this year, maybe that's an option for next year. And maybe that's the best case scenario, but I just don't see it happening.
Yeah. And I will, completely accept that everything you've said there about the start, I think was a good draft, really good draft this year. And I think they've set the situation up so that they can have success. And I completely accept that. I am not saying for a second that it's impossible for Pete Carroll to win. I just don't see, I don't have the same feeling. This is his 13th season.
Yeah.
I'm a firm believer in that coaches do have a shelf life with teams. I don't think it can go on and on. If people want to use Bill Belichick as an example, I mean, you might as well say every band should be like the Beatles. It's just not.
And also, look how the Patriots are sort of trending right now.
Yeah. It was Brady.
Yeah.
It was Tom Brady. And listen, it can't go on forever. I'm not an ageist, and I don't like to linger, but the man is 71 in about 2 weeks' time. Eventually you cannot just keep going on and on. And I'm a bit bored of hearing the same messages. And I suspect that there are players there who feel the same way. And I want a bit of excitement, but I'm not going to write it off. And I was just actually looking, Jeff, while you were speaking, because I sort of just cropped into my mind that I don't think anybody would look at the Denver Broncos Super Bowl 50 coaching staff of Gary Kubiak and Wade Phillips, led by, the crumbling body of Peyton Manning in that Super Bowl, and say, well, this was an elite setup from top to bottom, and that this was the most progressive, forward-thinking regime ever. And that was only a few years ago, and they won a Super Bowl because they played great, because Wade Phillips put a great defense together. And if the Seahawks can do that and they can get a quarterback next year, there's no reason why they can't be competitive. I'm not saying that they go and win a Super Bowl like that, but the aim of the NFL is to win a Super Bowl. But if you are competing most seasons and you are getting to sort of the occasional NFC Championship game, which is what the Seahawks haven't been able to do under Russell Wilson, that's why they've wasted the Wilson era, because more than half the NFC's got to an NFC Championship game since the last time Seattle was there. They've wasted years. If you can get back to sort of being in contention for that, then you're on the right track. But can they do that? Yes, if they get the right quarterback. How easy is it to do that? Yeah, big if. So we'll see. And I am willing to admit that statement that I made earlier, that I'm ready for a change and have been for some time. I will completely take that back and apologize and admit that I was wrong if this season goes in a different direction. I don't
think you have to, though. I think it's a pretty fair statement. And I think you've seen 12 years of the guy. And again, that's an eternity in coaching. And so a lot of people, they just hit their ceilings and it's time for a change. And I know it's easy to say change for the sake of one, but there's just not many people who've been able to do it over and over. And we see it now. Belichick is probably one of the best game planning strategists of all time. But from a roster building standpoint, he's been pretty bad. And they bungled a lot of drafts. And that's not his specialty. His specialty is tactical management and strategy and finding value in trades and things like that. But New England looks like one of the more underwhelming teams in the NFL with almost no direction. If you look at New England, for example, they have what's considered the greatest coach of all time, but they're almost directionless right now as a franchise. And so you worry from the Seahawks standpoint, is that what's going to happen now? Because if you look at Seattle and you look at New England, who are their best players? Who are their core players? And that's what teams need to win the Super Bowl. The Rams won because they had Von Miller and Aaron Donald and Cooper Kupp. And Seahawks, when they won the Super Bowl, had all-stars. Now, the Seahawks' best players are DK Metcalf, Quandre Diggs. That's not the core of a Super Bowl team. So, Pete Carroll or not, they're not winning with this roster. So, who's the most likely way to win? You got to get a quarterback. And Pete Carroll, the guy to develop that next quarterback, it's hard to imagine he is. So, I think anyone with that opinion is fully valid, even if they do turn this thing around and get it back. I think that's a totally valid statement.
And just to sort of wrap up here, Jeff, cut down days tomorrow. What do you think we're going to see? Are we going to see a bludgeoning of this roster on the fringes? There's a whole bunch of young players who I don't think justify a roster spot just because they happen to be here. There are positions like the linebacker position. I don't think anybody stood out there. They need to add somebody. You see people like Jared Davis are going to be cut by, I think, the Lions. As mediocre and as underwhelming as his career's been, which is a real shame because I thought in Florida he looked very interesting. But is somebody like that a better option for the Seahawks, even if it's just for depth more than anything else, than the guys who've been playing rather poorly and missing tackles during preseason? Are they going to move on from the Bo Meltons and the Freddie Swains and all of those guys and just say we're going to go and bring somebody on the outside to be our sixth receiver? Let's say, let's assume they keep Goodwin and Eskridge and Young, who seems to have got a good press for what he's done during training camp. Is the 6-1 going to be somebody from the outside? Are they going to look at other positions? Are we going to see a lot of movement coming in to this team? Maybe a cheap throwaway trade like they did with Arcega Whiteside to have a look at somebody. How active do you think the Seahawks are going to be over the next 24 hours?
I think they will be active, but it's just not a very interesting active. I think it's exactly what you talked about. I think they can't go into the season or comfortably go into the season with the inside linebacker group they have now. Because if Jordan Brooks get hurt, they're going to be unable to function on defense because of how bad their middle of the field will be. Because then all of a sudden you have Cody Barton and Nick Bellore as your two linebackers. Maybe they should extend KJ Wright's one-day contract. I don't know. But they need to get better at the personnel. I know Tanner Muse is more of a special teams only guy. The guy they brought in from Chicago was cut after the first preseason game or the second preseason game. And that group sucks outside of Brooks. So receiving depth, you talked about it. They have some very fringe receivers right now that aren't progressing. Freddie Swain's really taken a step back, it seems, this year. And that's an area they can look to add. But I don't think it's going to be anything too splashy. I think they've done a lot. Like they got Justin Coleman years ago as a kind of cut deadline trade. They've added special teams value a lot. So I think it's going to be more of the fringes of the roster because I think this is one of the easiest Seattle rosters to pick in quite some time because there aren't a lot of interesting position battles. And frankly, a lot of the ones where they were close, like the cornerback group, for example, like it's pretty clear who the top 5 or 6 guys were. And they traded Ugo Amadi away. It's a pretty easy group to make. Like it's pretty easy to figure out who that is. The receiver group, there's a couple guys, and then the bottom, maybe they take 6, maybe they take 5. There's not much there. So I think you're going to see maybe a trade for just some depth purposes, maybe a receiver, maybe a inside linebacker, maybe a 9th offensive lineman. But top to bottom, there's from like 53 below on the Seahawks, there's very little there. So there's going to be movement that you'll see some things happen, but there'll be things you probably read your phone once and then go on to the next thing. I don't think it's going to be very interesting.
Do you think there's any chance they'll try and send a message, though? I just wonder. I mean, and I tend to agree with you. I think that's probably more likely than not. But I just wonder whether there's some big talk for Pete Carroll after the Chicago game of either you do this, the tackling and the special teams, or you're not going to be here. And I don't know. It just, when I look at the roster, it feels like there's about 25 players who you think, okay, they legitimately deserve to be here. And then there's about 25 to 30 others, Jeff, who you just think you may well make all of these projections on everybody's 53-man roster guesses that are going to be in the media for the next 24 hours. But if you were booted off somewhere else, it would be completely justified. And I can run through some of the names for you. You could go through the receivers. I don't think people like Freddie Swain necessarily deserve to be here. Yeah. I think if you look at, it wasn't for the fact they're a bit thin. What on earth is Gabe Jackson? Why is Gabe Jackson on this roster? Why did they trade for him last year? Desperation, and that's it. And then they extended him to make sure that he didn't retire or whatever he was going to do otherwise. And they're stuck with him now, unless they can trade him for a bag of balls. But he's somebody who has shown absolutely nothing since he's been here, other than he's past his best. LJ Collier, get rid of him. Financially, it doesn't make sense, but you can't look. If you're going to seriously fix this roster, you can't be saying, "Oh, we're going to keep him because it makes $1 million worth of sense." You need to send a message. No matter whether you're first round pick or not. If you don't get out in the field and you don't perform, you're out. Off you go. Go and play somewhere else. You can run through the list. You mentioned some of these defensive players. They got rid of the guy from Chicago. What are some of these other guys showing? Very, very little. Marquise Blair, is he showing enough? What has he shown to warrant sticking around? And what's Justin Coleman shown? People like Mike Jackson have put their hand up and said, I'm making this roster. He's the kind of guy that you put on the roster. Some of these other names that I'm mentioning here have just been crap. They either can't stay healthy, or they're not good enough, or they're not showing enough. And, this was a big year. This was a big training camp. It's a turn another page. Go out there and show what you're worth. And I kind of feel like we're sat here and go, okay, well, Tariq Woolen and Bryant showed some good things, and the young offensive tackle showed something, and maybe Boya Mafe has shown some promise as well. But there's a whole 20 guys who you're just thinking, oh, how are they going to play? They're healthy again. They're back. And you just think, no, you're not good enough. You've no reason to be here other than you're here, so therefore you stay because we've invested a pick in you, or because we might have to go and get somebody else. And for that reason, I just wonder, are there going to be sort of 10 spots that you didn't? Are there going to be some surprises maybe that you think, okay, we're just going to try other people. We're just going to try other people and create the kind of 2010. If you don't deliver, you're out and somebody else is coming in. And maybe that's better for the Seahawks. I think it'd be more entertaining, whether it'd be the right thing to do or not. But I'm not that worried that someone like Marquise Blair or Gabe Jackson or whoever else is going to go off somewhere else and be gangbusters. I mean, frankly, if they could, they should be getting rid of Jamal Adams and a few others as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's sort of the beauty of this season, is that they should be sort of setting the tone for the foundation of their team. And, for example, you mentioned Collier. Collier, someone I don't think should make the roster. And I think that does send a message. He was a first-round pick 3 years ago. And I think Miles Adams has been one of the few bright spots of this ugly preseason. I think Miles Adams earned a spot on the team over him, and I don't think Collier should make it. Marquise Blair, if Ryan Neal was healthy, I don't think he would make the team. I don't think he's played enough to make. He's been a disaster from a tackling standpoint, and that's supposed to be his one strength. So Miles Jackson, you mentioned Miles Adams, Michael Jackson. Those were probably the two most impressive preseason players on the team, other than some of the core players we've seen and all those videos have circulated. But yeah, guys like Collier and Blair, who were high drafted guys who were supposed to flash, I don't think there's a case for them at all. And if Pete's trying to kind of reset the program, and the famous move he made at the beginning of this is where he cut Lendale White, which was his guy from USC, after the first team meeting. And that really set the table. And TJ Houshmandzadeh, if you remember, he was cut too. And that really set a tone for what's accepted. And
Lofa Tatopu and people like that, they were out pretty quickly. Yeah. He didn't draft Taylor Mays. He was sending a message.
Yeah, and I think that set the table for – and they need people in the organization to – Jamal Adams is not that guy. He's not the guy who's going to set the table for what's acceptable in the organization. That's what they had that was so good. The players were really in control of the building. And, yeah, Collier, Blair – those guys shouldn't be on the team. Their draft status, that should be out the window at this point. And man, that 2019 class is not very good. We talked about that earlier. It's not an impressive draft run there. But yeah, they need to send a message, because they've had a weird approach to preseason where they've held out. They don't have a lot of playmakers on this defense that are proven. And they held out Brooks, they held out Adams, they held out Diggs. And those are their three probably playmakers at this point. And without them on defense, that you saw how talentless they looked on defense. And you're just going to throw those guys in and hope things are better. But there's just a lot of question marks surrounding that group right now. And they do kind of need to send the message and kind of set the tone for their season and kind of the next phase of the Seahawks team. Because right now, other than the play of the offensive tackles and some of the young corners, it's been an ugly preseason. And I encourage all of you to go watch some of Jeff Schwartz's videos. I can't tell you, a lot of the offensive line experts I read, like Jeff Schwartz and I can't remember the guy from the Athletic, and Brandon Thorne from the Athletic. They have almost never talked about a Seahawks offensive line in probably 12 years, just showing clips. There's videos of Cross and Abe Lucas after every game now. So
can I just say something though, Jess? And apologies to interrupt you, because I do think this is important. I'm not for a minute suggesting that Jeff Schwartz is in any way biased or that it impacts his credibility. I'm not saying that, and I hope people don't read that into it. But I do think it's important to mention that Jeff Schwartz was a big part of a Duke Manyweather documentary about how great he is as an offensive line coach. And one of Duke Manyweather's
Jeff Schwartz is definitely biased.
And one of Duke Manyweather's clients is Charles Cross.
Yeah.
So I think, I always kind of feel like that has to be mentioned when we're sort of reflecting on these things. Jeff Schwartz does have a vested interest, even if this is an honest opinion.
He's definitely biased for sure. It's nice to see some positives because that was ugly. That preseason was ugly. And if that carries over into the season, this is going to be one of the more unwatchable Seahawks team in 2 decades. But it's just nice to see something come out of it with the rookie class. But yeah, I'm with you. And as I said at the beginning of the show, there's a huge difference between playing backups and playing Nick Bosa, Hutchinson, Cam Jordan back to back weeks. I think there's going to be a huge learning curve for both those guys. And I think if the team has the right mindset, that's okay. That's part of the point of this year, is that you're hoping these guys by the end of the year, they're ascending as the quarterback comes in, and that all times out together. So I think it's going to look a lot different when the real lights come on. And even Bradley Chubb and Randy Gregory week 1, that's a lot different than playing against some of the backups they've seen on the Bears. And he had 1 snap against Robert Quinn. Like, I'm not saying these guys are going to be ready-made studs. Like, I don't think so. But to your point, I think they need to kind of shake this up because just the vibe around the team right now seems real poor.
Yeah, it seems a bit of a flat team. And I think in 2011, 2010, there was a bit of a buzz that's missing at the moment. And, someone just mentioned D. Eskridge there. And it's kind of little things like that. D. Eskridge has been a letdown. They can't get him on the field. He can't get healthy. When you see someone like Laviska Shenault has just been caught or has been traded, hasn't he? He's been traded. I can't remember where he's gone, but the Jaguars have traded him. You're already seeing Alex Leatherwood's at risk in Las Vegas. He might get caught or traded by the Raiders. And you kind of wonder, Jeff, like what is sending a message? What is sending a message? Is it just saying, is it being willing to say, I'm going to swap D. Eskridge for somebody else's player who's in a similar position? I don't know. I mean, maybe they think it's too soon to do that after 1 year. But you know what I mean? It's just like that. Anybody is at risk here, or everybody's at risk. If you do not deliver, if you do not do your job, if you can't stay healthy, you're not going to be part of this. It feels to me like that message needs to be sent over the next few days. And I hope it is. And I hope they're willing to make some difficult decisions. I hope they're not just going to stay loyal to high draft picks. And we need 53, and we can get rid of these 3 guys who don't really mean much, but otherwise everybody else is going to stay, and it's going to be quite underwhelming because we're just going to crack on with what we've got. I'd like to see this team shoot to try and find some guys and also have the wherewithal, Jeff, like they did in 2010, to make an inspired trade if there isn't a chance to do it. That Marshawn Lynch trade 4 weeks into the 2010 season changed the franchise forever. I'm not suggesting that that's possible again. That's probably a once in a lifetime trade. But can you do something that at least impacts your team and produces something moving forward? Chris Clemens wasn't a once in a lifetime trade, but they did that before the 2010 season and it paid dividends. Can they do something again over the next few days that can just get somebody in? Can they be ruthless? Can they be honest about where this roster is? There are certain guys like Adams that they can't move. That will come. But there are other players that maybe they can move on in the next few days to just sort of send that message that we're hoping that they will send. Interesting conversation. I mean, I think it's never dull, Jeff. I think there are seriously dull points of 2022, and it is going to be a year to be endured rather than enjoyed. But I do think it is still quite interesting to see how this all plays out. And I am looking forward to watching the college football. Are you going to do you get into the college football? Do you watch a lot of that as it's happening? Or are you more someone who, when it's finished, you will go and have a look at players in the draft and see what options are there? How do you approach that? Because I know a lot of my weekends are going to be spent plowing through hours of college football games, and I've got saved on my system driving my wife balmy.
Yeah, it's frankly, I'm lucky that I follow the NFL very closely, and even if when the Seahawks weren't very watchable last year, I just found there's enough games and teams I'm interested in on a Sunday, and I basically block off my entire Sunday afternoons every Sunday. So Seahawks aren't playing well and they aren't very watchable. I'm going to watch a lot of the Chargers this year, for example. I think they're as fun as it gets. College football, I haven't been invested in like a college football quarterback year in quite some time because I always follow them and track who the prospects are because I love following the draft. It's probably my favorite football event of the year. But this is the first year like I'm going to be really invested since the Russell Wilson draft. And
what does that mean for you? Does that mean you will watch games live? Does it mean that you're going to catch up and sort of watch things in the week? I'm sure there's going to be a lot. So we live in a different era now. 10 years ago when Wilson was coming through, you didn't have Twitter breaking down clips in 2 minutes so that you can get a feel for who these players are. There was basically one website, Draft Breakdown, that posted the odd game in sort of condensed form, and that was it. We live in a different era. So what are you doing? Are you watching the games, or do you sort of catch up in the week? How do you do it?
I'm going to be watching probably as much as some of the bigger games. I'll probably try to watch Stroud and Bryce Young as much as I can. I don't know how much access I'll have to Kentucky games, so I'm going to try to follow along more clips, and I'm probably going to try to watch a lot more Saturday football than I usually do, because I'm usually watching defensive players and offensive linemen, because that's usually position groups that we've been needing to work on. But it's a lot more like the Ohio State, Alabama. Those are always going to be on TV for me, and now they're going to be a lot more meaningful. But I'm sort of with you on Bryce Young. I'm not crazy about him. I don't know if I want to go through another small quarterback thing. So I'm hoping kind of the transition from Russell would be the Will Levis type, the big Josh Allen style quarterback. And so, yeah, it's going to be a fun year from that standpoint, because I don't much. The Seahawks are starting to be background noise to me this year. And I'm again, like if it was a Madden season, I'd be simulating right to the draft.
Yeah, and just to finish, I will say that I'm sort of with you on Bryce Young, and I think CJ Stroud is. I've voiced some concerns there. I think Will Levis is the guy. If people are watching, we get a lot of the SEC games over here in the UK, so I suspect you will get a fair bit of Kentucky. But I think Van Dyke at Miami is the other guy to seriously keep an eye on here. As long as the offense doesn't sort of turn him into check down Charlie, then it should be okay. We will see. But I think he's sort of that big, athletic, strong-armed quarterback who'd be a nice alternative to Levis. But I'm convinced that the Seahawks will have earmarked Levis as a guy that they like. And now it's just a case of what he can do this year. And while we're on the subject, if you want to check out my interview with Will Levis, it is on the channel now, and you can find it on there. So have a listen to what he had to say. Jeff, it's always a pleasure having you on, and thank you for being very generous with your time again. We're 20 minutes over an hour. So thank you for that. And I know everybody loves having you on and hearing your views. So really appreciate it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and to like the video. That really helps. Get the subscriptions up as well. We will have more of these as we build up to the start of the season, and all the regular content will be there. Check out the Rebuild podcast as well. Lots of interesting things coming up over the next few months. So you want to stick right here with this channel and with SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Until next time, we'll see you then. Bye for now.